Right, my name is Vic Watson, hello. I was born in 1945, so that makes me 68. I was born in Scarborough in North Yorkshire, so I'm a Scarborian, but I've lived in Huddersfield for the last 43 years. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my life. It has been an interesting one, and I hope there's going to be a lot more years to go yet. Scarborough was a wonderful place to grow up in. And I must remember not to keep saying because that's bad. Anyway, different things happened when I was young. I have written a book about this called Living with a Hyacinth. My mother was Hyacinth Bouquet 60 years before it came on television. She always thought she was just a little bit better than anybody else. One of the things that my brother did tell me about when I was a little child of probably 2 or 3 years old, we lived in a downstairs basement flat, as you could call it, a flat, with an outside privy, and I used to get into serious trouble because the water flowed straight underneath, and there was 4 houses that shared this privy. They were all private, but the water flowed underneath to take away the waste, and I would tend to put a lighted piece of paper on the water, and if anybody was sat at the other end, they got their arse singed, and I used to get a slap for being naughty. But my brother once told me that if I didn't get my own way, I would go out into the passageway which led to the privy, and was concrete slabs, and lay down on the floor and bang my head on the concrete slabs. Now, I can't imagine that I would do a thing like that, honest. When I was still in the pram, and you could go into shops and leave prams outside without any fear of anybody hurting or stealing you, Ron told me that he and his mother went into the shop one day, and they'd only been in there about 10 minutes maybe, and they heard a woman scream, and their mother came out, rushed out to see what was happening, and she screamed as well. Ron told me, Ron is my brother, Ron told me that my face was covered in blood, in inverted commas, and so were my hands. And apparently what I'd done, I'd gone into my mother's handbag, which was under the apron of the pram, and took her lipstick out and ate it because it looked nice. And of course in those days it was just red. You didn't have any other kind, you just had red lipstick. So consequently it was on my fingers, it was on my face, and it did look like blood. Another time, we went up to Inderwell Park in Scarborough, and I was running, and I tripped and fell on a rock that was sticking up out of the ground, and it knocked the 2 front teeth that I had in my mouth, knocked them out immediately, and ever since that time I've had problems with my teeth. So if you only see 4 teeth, that's all I've got, the rest have gone. And I'm too young to have false teeth, so I'm not going to bother. When I was about 5, I think it was 4 or 5, I was very seriously ill with gastroenteritis and had to go into Scarborough Hospital. And obviously this would have been around about 1949, 1950, when certain things were in their infancy. Penicillin, although available, if you needed it urgently, you had to pay for it. We couldn't afford it, and a gentleman by the name of Peter Giacomelli, who was an ice cream, he had an ice cream business and was a businessman, came forward and paid for this course of penicillin that I had to have. He was what do you call it, a philanthropist, I think that's the word. He'd helped a lot of young people, a lot of children to get better, especially after the war, when it was, you know, you got all sorts of different things. And forevermore after that, when I was well, until I left Scarborough. We used to go to a big Christmas party that Peter Giacomelli put on at the hospital for all the children he'd helped. He was a fabulous chap, and I would say probably about 12 years ago, 15 years ago, I went back to Scarborough, and I went to Peter Giacomelli's ice cream parlour, and he was there, big man, sat down on a chair behind the counter, and I spoke to him and I told him, and he obviously, he said he remembered, I don't think he did, but then he'd helped so many children. But I was able to thank him because I thought that was a really nice thing to do. We left Scarborough and we went to live in, where did we go from Scarborough? The problem was with my mother, she wasn't a gypsy, but she wouldn't stay in any place long. She just, I don't know, she just, when me and my mother were together, it was like, what do they call it, an irresistible force meeting an immovable object. We just argued all the time. We left, well, I must admit, we left West Park Terrace, went to live at 89 St Leonard's Crescent in Scarborough. That was a lovely place. Sad to say, that's where my father passed away, and it was really bad because it was Christmas 1953. I was taken to a big store in Scarborough called Boys that had this massive roundabout, and when I came home, my brother just said that Mum was crying, and I wanted to know why, and she told me that my dad had gone to live with the angels. There was an inquest on this because the doctor, our doctor, who was not available because he was away for Christmas, there was a locum called Dr. Cayley, never forget his name, and apparently he'd come in the afternoon on Christmas Eve and said to my dad, I'm not going to give you anything now. He says, come into the surgery a day after Boxing Day and I'll give you some tablets. If he'd have given him the tablets there and then, he probably would have been okay. But it was so bad, he was so poorly that Dad died that night. And so consequently, you know, Christmas wasn't very good. We didn't have any food in because obviously my mother had been looking after my dad and hadn't gone out shopping. And something happened on Christmas Day, and I can remember this happening. The door was knocked, and my mother just said to Ron, just answer it and tell people that she don't want to speak to anybody. But it was Irene and Bernie Dove from across the road, and they knew my mother and father, and they'd gone round the whole of the estate from the very top of St Leonard's Crescent right to the very bottom. They'd gone to everybody's house, and everybody had donated some item of food. And they came in and they had loads and loads of shopping bags full of food. And it took Mrs. Dove and my mother ages to put this food into the pantry. And this is something that I don't think would happen in this day and age. That was how close people were. And you've heard the expression, you know, we never locked our door. It was true. You never locked your front door. You went out. You knew that nothing was going to happen. Nobody was going to come in and stab you or anything like that. Not like it is nowadays, I'm afraid. So it was a nicer time. 2 years went past, and suddenly there was another man in the family, and he was called Sid, and he was a gardener. And we stayed at 89 St Leonard's Crescent for about another 2 or 3 months. And they went off one day and came back, and I was told that we were moving. And I was 9 now, and we moved to a place called High Mill Drive at Burniston. And it was one of the nicest places I've ever lived. It was a beautiful semi-detached house that went with the job. Sid was a good gardener. That was about all he was good at. I didn't like him. We didn't get on at all. One day I had to go and give a message. Now the place that he worked at was down a tree-lined drive, thick privet tree line, right high, 12 foot high, and at the bottom of this tree-lined avenue or tree-lined drive was a big gate, an electronic gate, and I had to press a button, and then the gate was opened and I went in. What I didn't realise was that the dog, who was called Skipper and was a golden Labrador, got out, and I was in serious trouble by my mother. And Skipper had gone down to what they called the weir, which was actually across the main road in Burniston. And he'd got down onto the weir, and it was always muddy down there, and he'd rolled in this mud, and this lovely golden Labrador now was a black Labrador. But they got him back, the chauffeur got him back, and they washed him, and everything was fine, and that was it. When I was at home, I was scolded by my mother. I don't mean scolded, I mean scolded, you know, told off. And I had to go and apologise to Mr. and Mrs. Bailey, who were my stepfather's employers. And they were really, really nice. They said, Adrian, there's nothing done that's been done wrong. Here's an apple, here's an orange, here's a bag of sweets. And of course that was me. I was dead chuffed about this. And came back and told my mother, and she was a bit miffed that I hadn't been thrashed, I think it was. One of the things that my mother did while we were there at High Mill Drive, she took what was known as a displaced person. A little girl who lived in Germany, had no mother and father, and she was called Anna Radoschitz, and she came to live with us. And for 6 months it was lovely, because I still had to go to school, but when I came home there was always somebody there to play with, so that was great. I had my 10th birthday there, and that was when my mother opened her heart up, and we had a garage. We didn't have a car, but there was a garage attached to the house, and that garage was turned into a fabulous party room. My mother really went to town, about the only thing she ever did do. And we had this lovely party, and had all my school friends, and of course Anna was there. After 6 months, Anna had to go back to Germany, and we had to take her to London, and that was the first time I ever went to London. I was probably 11 by now, well, 10 and a half anyway, and we took her down, and we had to go and see a man called Mr. Karminski, and he was a German and a really nice guy, and he insisted that we stayed there, and he had a mattress laid down in the sitting room so that we could sleep. And on the second day we were there, we were going to have this meal that they cooked in Germany and Czechoslovakia and all those other things, called Walsh. I've never tasted anything so disgusting in my life. Walsh is made of rhubarb roots, carrot roots, all things like that, nothing like we would normally eat. And then it's strained and it's ladled into you, and you put a big blob of cream in the middle of it. Oh, it was absolutely disgusting. The only other thing that was on the table was some little cream biscuits about that big, and that's what we just ate those. That was all. Even my mother didn't like borscht, and she wasn't particularly a fussy eater. So on the second day that we were there, Mr. Karminski took us in his car round Marble Arch, or he took us round to show us one or two sights of London. I'd never seen them before, and talk about a mad brain driver round Marble Arch, 40 miles an hour, didn't give a monkeys about other vehicles, although there wasn't a lot of vehicles on the road in the late, in the middle 50s, but there was enough. And I think my mother was having a baby in the back because she didn't like speed at all. One of the things that we did in Scarborough, a friend of mine called Richard Wright, there was a road on the Burniston, it was Burniston Road, and there was a lot of railings along the roadside, and there was one or two railings that weren't very stable, shall we say, and we could just squeeze through there. And we used to go down this little incline down to the very bottom, and you came out at the back of Peazone Park, with the little train line going round, but very much opposite where we came down was the open air theatre. And many a time we used to go down there and sit in the bushes watching the actors at the backstage, always dressed as Arabs. Now there was a singer in the 50s called John Hanson, and John Hanson used to every year do the Desert Song on the open air theatre stage. And one day we were there, and we must have been just a little bit nearer than what we normally did. And I can remember John Hanson came off stage through one of the exits from the stage, and at the back of the stage, and he must have just seen us as he came off, and he just went like that and waved to us, and we kept saying, John Hanson's waved to us, John Hanson's waved to us, because John Hanson was the bee's knees. He was a fabulous singer. I'm going to tell you now about my grandma, because I thought my granny and grandma were wonderful people. We used to take a bus from Scarborough to York. No, we didn't. We went from Scarborough to Malton, Malton to York, York to Harrogate. And my grandparents lived at 97 Station Parade, Harrogate. And it was a big 5-storey Victorian house. There was about 7 in Station Parade at that time. And we used to go up the steps to the door, and Mother used to ring the bell, and Grandma would hobble down. She had something wrong with her leg. And she'd open the door and say, "Hello, Moo, what time are you leaving?" Now, my mother hated Moo. Not M-O, it was M-U, Mew. Because she was called Rosemary Muriel, but Grandma would always insist on calling her Mew, and it used to upset my mother. She used to keep saying, "I'm not called Mew, I'm called Rosemary." But I just love going to my grandma's. What we used to do is we used to have a cup of tea, sit and chat for half an hour, and then we'd go out and do a little bit of shopping in Harrogate. And Mother always used to buy a strawberry tart from a shop called Standings, which was a very high-class grocery shop. I loved going in there because there were hams and hocks and all sorts of meats hanging up, and the smell was absolutely amazing. It was a lovely place. Everything was weighed out. There was nothing pre-packed in those days. Nothing. You didn't get pre-packed food except if it was in tins. But butter, sugar, tea, all was weighed out in a blue piece of sugar paper and then folded and sealed. I can remember, I'm just looking at my book actually, because I've got to get this right. One of the things that I used to listen to Grandma doing was putting the order in for what she wanted. The reason they lived at 97 Station Parade was because it was a residential house for ladies. They had, there was 2 lots of rooms on each floor, so there was a suite of rooms twice on each floor, and there were 5 floors. The first floor, the top floor, was used as storerooms for linen and things like that. So there was 2, 4, 6. There was 8 residents, all elderly ladies, and Grandma used to. This was the kind of order that she would make. Where are we? Yeah, one of the things I can remember was the grocery order that Grandma placed with Standings. The phone was in the pantry. Now, the pantry was not an ordinary pantry like we have. It was a room. It was a very long room, probably as long as the room I'm in now, and half as narrow. And there was all sorts of wonderful foods in this pantry. But the order that she placed every week with Standings was something like this. £4 of best butter, £4 of best cooking fat. I mean, what kind of cooking fat is there? There's nothing, you know, you don't have best cooking fat, but everything had to be best. 4 dozen fresh brown eggs. She would not have white eggs, she had to have brown eggs. £6 of self-raising flour. £4 of best China tea. £4 of best coffee beans. Everything had best in front of it for Grandma. 2 dozen best tomatoes. £12 of white potatoes. 4 cabbages. £16 of sprouts. 14 cauliflowers. £6 of sugar. £5 of bacon. £2 of best quality ham, and so on and so on and so on. And although these ladies didn't dine with us, Grandma used to provide them with the food. If whatever they wanted, she would provide it. And they had a little kitchenette in the sitting room, and their bedroom, that was their suite of rooms. But when we sat and had our tea or dinner, Grandma used to say, "Right, Moo, you lay the table." So my mother would put knife and fork, and there was Granny and Grandad, there was myself and my mother, and there was Uncle Ron and Auntie Reenie. Now, this was a mute point with my mother, because Uncle Ron and Auntie Reenie weren't married, and in those days that was frowned upon. If you weren't married, it was frowned upon. But Reenie was really a lovely person. I liked her a great deal. My mother didn't like anybody, and she always used to say, "It's disgusting, it's disgusting." But anyway, my grandma used to come in and see the table, and she'd say, "Moo, that's not how we have the table laid." She'd take all the knives and forks off. She'd put a clean white tablecloth on, lay the table again, but this time there would be 2 knives, 2 forks, and a fork and spoon at the top for the sweet. And there'd be salt and pepper, there'd be piccalilli and pickle, and serviettes. We always had serviettes with a little gold ring round them. My mother didn't bother about things like that. She'd watch a lot of palaver, and she never used a serviette. I used to enjoy it. I used to think it was wonderful. And my Uncle Ron was a colour sergeant. He was with the 8th Army, with Montgomery, and he was a big man. He was 6'5", and he'd got a great big moustache which was waxed at the end, and he had a booming voice, and I used to think the world of him. And he always used to say, "Come on, bud, tuck in, it's there to eat, not to look at." And that used to annoy my mother something rotten, because when she made a meal, you got what you were given, and if you didn't have it, you didn't eat. It was as simple as that. But you always had, at Grandma's, you always had a choice of what you wanted. Ham, beef, you name it, it was there. They lived very well, but they were quite well off. One of the things I can remember, in the drawing room that was at Grandma's, that's where the television was, it was all sorts of things. Apparently my granddad had been a policeman, quite a high up policeman on the island of Malta in the war, and there was a lot of Maltese furniture that he'd brought back. But there was one particular piece of furniture that I thought was absolutely wonderful. It was a big black sideboard, a massive sideboard with big grapes carved into the edge. And on that sideboard there was all sorts of different things, but there was one particular thing that I used to really like, and it was a bottle with a lever on. Now, I didn't know at that time it was what was a soda siphon, but that lever really intrigued me, and I used to press the lever and this water used to squirt out. And there was a lady that used to come in and clean for Grandma. What was she called? I can't remember her name. But she used to always say, you know, she'd say, "There's always a lot of water on the sideboard and I can't understand, is the soda siphon leaking?" And of course, never ever did I say, well, it was me. Which leads me to another thing. Grandad had a greenhouse, and it was right down at the bottom of the garden. And he grew tomatoes. Now, when you went into this greenhouse, you went down 3 steps into it as well. And there was a big Belfast sink there, which was quite a lot of people have these sinks in the greenhouses. And there was a tap above it. And I went in the greenhouse one day just to have a look. And of course, being the kind of person I am, I turned this tap on. Well, I turned it on, but I couldn't turn the damn thing off. It just kept, and no matter how hard I tried, it would not turn off. So consequently, I just came out the greenhouse and went down to the very bottom of the garden to look over the edge, which had the train lines into Harrogate, and the train used to come past, so I used to watch that. When Grandad came home, I mean, I'd gone back inside by then, but Grandad went down to his greenhouse and he came back in and he said, "That damn tap has leaked again and it's ruined all the tomato plants." And it had flooded, and it was about a foot deep with water. It was on the second step. Nobody ever knew that it was Victor that had turned that tap on. Yeah, I'll have to just tell this last bit about Grandad. Finally, another I'm going to laugh because I know what's coming. Grandad used to use something called brilliantine on his hair, which was very popular in those days. It was just a green liquid, and you just went like that, a bit like what we call gel nowadays. And I always used to say to Grandad, "Grandad, why do you put that on your head now? What do you call it?" And he said, "It's lard." He said, "I just put a bit of lard on my head." So when Grandad went to work, I went into the pantry and I thought, I'll have my head done like that. So what did I do? I took a knife and cut a bit of lard off the piece that was in the pantry and rubbed it into my hair, and it just melted and ran down my face like that. And my mother came in. She said, "What's up with your face?" And I said, "Well, I've just put what Grandad puts on his hair, but it's melted." And she said, "What is it?" I said, "Lard." And of course everybody laughed. They thought it was really funny, and that's how naive I was then, you see. Suddenly we were on the move again, and we left Scarborough and we went to live in a town called Soby Ridge, which is not very far from here in actual fact. Sid had got a job as head gardener and there was a house attached to it. That's where my mother was taken ill. She got pneumonia, and every day the nurse came and they put this thing on her chest called a kaolin and morphine poultice, and it stank. It would just smelt like a hospital in this house. But she was very poorly, but she managed to beat it and she was okay. But Soby Bridge was the very first time that I ever went to the cinema on my own. What was happening was I was going to the Saturday morning pictures, as a lot of the cinemas used to run Saturday morning kids clubs, and I think I would probably be about 11 or 12 now. And at that time, of course, one of the most popular forms of music was skiffle, and the cinema that I went to in Soby Ridge was called the Roxy, and we formed our own little skiffle group called the Roxy Four. And you know, I can't even remember the lads' names now, but one of them had a tea chest that his dad had got him, and if you put a little bit of string through a hole in the tea chest and knotted it, and then an old broom handle was just inserted at the top with the string attached to that so it went down. If you pulled the broom handle back and forward and plucked the string, you got different notes. So we had that was our double bass. One of the lads had a little drum, one of the other lads had a guitar, and I stole, or borrowed shall we say, my mother's washboard, which was a glass one. And because she was a dressmaker, she had loads of thimbles, so I got plenty of thimbles, and I used to play this washboard like that. I got a thumping for that because I wasn't supposed to take her thimbles. But we used to do things like Rock Island Line and My Old Man's a Dustman, all Lonnie Donegan stuff, because he was the bee's knees around about that time. I was allowed to go to the cinema at night on my own for the very first time to the Roxy, and the very first film I ever went to see on my own was Elvis Presley in Love Me Tender, and I was dead chuffed that I'd been allowed to go to the cinema on my own.
Love me tender, love me sweet, never let me go. You have made my life complete, and I love you so.
All of a sudden, we were on the move again. We'd lived there, less than 18 months. My mother didn't like it. It had made her ill. And we ended up at a place called Chapelthorpe, which is just outside Wakefield. 27 Wood Lane, Chapelthorpe. A fabulous place. I loved it there. Now, my mother was a very good dressmaker, and there was a lady that lived just quite close called Marion Henshaw, and she came to my mother and asked her if she would make her a full wardrobe. Now, a full wardrobe in the 50s were 12 dresses and a coat and maybe a hat. Well, my mother wasn't a milliner, but she could make hats. Anyway, she did these 12 dresses for Marion, and I don't know how it came about, but she didn't charge her. She became a partner in some horses that Marion Henshaw owned. She had 5 Palomino horses, fabulous animals, and there was a lovely young lady there called Mary who was the groom, and I used to go up and help Mary muck the horses out. We used to wash them and do their tails, and if we went to a show I used to go with Mary in the horse box, and I just loved it there. It was wonderful. One day it was suggested that Adrian, you see, I was always called Adrian up until coming to Huddersfield, so it was suggested that Adrian might like to learn to ride, and I thought, oh, this is going to be good. So we took some mountain steps down to the field, and there was Mary and Marion, and my mother and my stepfather and the chauffeur, George, the chauffeur. So there was quite a few people there, all come to see Adrian ride. Anyway, Mary went out with the bridle and called this lovely Palomino horse. It was called, the actual name of it was Golden Treasure of the Glen. That was its show name, but we just used to call it Treasure. And she was Treasure, like that. And this horse bounded up the field, and I thought, oh my God, it's a bit fast, is this? Now this horse was quite tall. It was 16 hands high, which is quite tall for a horse. Anyway, up I went on the mountain steps and got on the horse, and it set off, and it set off trotting. Should have set off walking, but it set off trotting. I'd only gone about 7 or 8 paces, and I said, oh no, I want to get off, I want to get off. So I did, I got off, and I got such a rollicking from my mother, because I'd shown her up in front of everybody, wanting to get off the horse. You know, there was no two ways about it. My mother wanted what she wanted, didn't matter what anybody else wanted. While I was there, I joined the Cubs, and I joined the choir, and the priest or the vicar of that area, it was called the Reverend James Mallin, and he was a fabulous guy, because not only was a priest, but every other month they used to have what they called a hoedown or a ceilidh, and the community centre that we had was turned into a barn. There was straw bales put in, and we had barbecues and things like that, sausage sandwiches and things like that. And I've got it written down here. The vicar would also call, the square dances. They had square dances, and he would call it, and it went something like this: take your partner round the waist, you move all round with all your haste, you move on down just like a hoe, you circle round and you do-si-do. I can see, that's something that I remember myself. I didn't need anybody's help. Everybody enjoyed themselves. It was just a fabulous night. But I hasten to add, my mother never went. Right, so I'm going to bring this right up to date now. Came to live in Huddersfield. First of all, I lived in Denbydale, and during the course of when we lived in Denbydale, and I say we when I talk about my wife and myself, we met a young man called Graham, and to cut a long story short, Graham came to live with us and we adopted Graham. And Graham went in the army, and I was very proud that we'd done something for this young man who had been, shall we say, a bit naughty in his life. And I'm hoping that we guided him, and he went into the army, and he must have told the boss, which was a Lieutenant Colonel Sharp, about us, and we had a personal invite from him to go to the passing out parade, and we were really, really proud of Graham. We got there, we were met at York Station because he was stationed at Strensall. We went by car to the army depot. Lieutenant Colonel Sharp met us. We went in and had a cup of coffee with him. We didn't see Graham until we went out, and we sat on the podium with the Lieutenant Colonel, which was fabulous. You know, we were his guests of honour. And at the end, we went back into his room, and we sat down and we talked, and he said, I've sent for Graham. He said he will come and have a chat to you, and the door knocked and the sergeant came and he said, Watson's here, sir. And Graham came in, and Lieutenant Colonel Sharp just said, right, he said, relax, he said, and stay with Margaret and Vic, he said, and have a chat, and then we'll see you when we've finished. The Lieutenant Colonel then went out of the room, and the first thing that Graham said was, look at all that silver, shall we nick it? No, it was very funny. I thought it was very funny. And when we'd finished, we were presented with a nice little present, and we were taken back to the station in York, and that was great. Graham came out the army, was invalided out the army. He fell out of a watchtower in Northern Ireland when he was on duty there. But he came out, he got himself a job, and he met Teresa, and they had two babies, Anne-Marie and James, and it's James that had been filming this, and I'm Grandad. So that more or less winds it up. The story is, of course, that I became Huddersfield Town Crier 17 years ago now. I'm still Huddersfield Town Crier, and it's a job that I really, really enjoy. So there you go. Now then, being reprinted, Memoirs of a Hyacinth. Okay, that will be available very soon, and I hope you'll want to have a read of it, because it does make very interesting reading. You'll learn about things that I've already talked about, but there's a lot in this book that I haven't been able to. It's been a pleasure doing this. Thank you.
Now here's a little story. To tell it is a must. About an unsung hero that moves away a dust. Some people make a fortune, others earn a mint. My old man don't earn much. In fact, he's flipping skint. Oh, my old man's a dustman. He wears a dustman's hat. He wears gold blimey trousers, and he lives in the council flat. He looks a proper nana in his great big hobnail boots. He's got such a job to pull them up, but he calls them daisy roots. Some folks give tips at Christmas, and some of them forget. So when he picks their bins up, he spills some on the step. Now one old man got nasty, and to the council wrote, next time my old man went round there, he punched him up the throat. Oh, my old man's a dustman. He wears a dustman's hat. He wears gold blimey trousers, and he lives in a council flat. I say, Les.
Yeah?
I found a police dog in my dustbin.
Well, how do you know he's a police dog?
He had a policeman with him. Though my old man's a dustman, he's got an heart of gold. He got married recently, though he's 86 years old. We said, here, hang on, Dad, you're getting past your prime. He said, well, when you get my age, it helps to pass the time. My old man's a dustman, he wears a dustman's hat. He wears gold trousers